being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. And, Richard, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we've reached the final 2 episodes of Season 2.
Yes, we have, and it's very hard to believe we're nearing the end of this season. But, as you say, we've still got 2 episodes left, and I'm very confident they're going to be good ones because we're finishing with a 2-part mini-series. It's on none other than Bernie Ecclestone, who, as Formula One's commercial rights holder, was F1's most powerful individual for nearly 40 years.
Yes, and we could probably have done 10 episodes on Bernie, or perhaps even 20. Such is the volume of material to pull from, but we're going to do 2, as you say. And on this, the first episode, we're going to look at how this son of a Suffolk trawlerman, because that's what he was, rose to become such a powerful figure in Formula One, one of the most powerful and influential people in sporting history, in fact, and a supremely wealthy one at that.
Yeah, and that's an important point. Whatever anyone might think of Bernie Ecclestone, his methods and the many controversies that surrounded him over the years, all of which we'll get into, it's indisputable that he was the central figure in creating the global phenomenon that Formula One is today. And chiefly, as we'll see, it was his foresight in appreciating and exploiting the value of broadcasting rights that really did revolutionize sport. And it was his example that the people running English football's biggest clubs very consciously followed when they created the Premier League with its multi-billion-pound TV deals. Younger listeners might find it hard to appreciate, especially when you consider the size and scale of Formula One in 2024, that when Bernie Ecclestone first rose to prominence as a power broker in the sport in the mid to late 1970s, it was still a very niche sport, run by amateurs and operating more as a minority activity for enthusiasts than as any kind of business. But fast forward to 2017, and at the end of his reign as F1 Supremo, F1 had morphed into the most watched global sport outside the Olympics and football's World Cup. Might F1 have got there without Bernie? Well, maybe, but that shouldn't diminish the scale of his achievements. Then again, just because the sport grew and grew and grew, it didn't mean everything he did was good.
No, that's true, and as we'll discuss, although Ecclestone grew Formula One immeasurably and very impressively, the methods via which he did that can and have been questioned. But anyway, we may come to some of that. Like his friend Max Mosley, the former president of the FIA, whom we've mentioned many times in previous episodes of this podcast, actually, Ecclestone was, I'm going to say this, fiendishly intelligent, albeit, less impressively articulate than Mosley was. And he, Ecclestone, could operate with both, or did operate with both cunning and ruthlessness. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, Bernie accumulated great personal wealth, enormous personal wealth with Formula One's expansion. I think his fortune is commonly valued at, nudging $3 billion now, but it may well be quite a bit more than that. And one of the criticisms often levelled at him was whether he did things for the good of the sport or for the good of his and Formula One management's bank balance, or of course all three. And that's one of the areas we'll get into over these next 2 pods as well.
Yes, but for this episode, we're going to start our examination of Bernard Charles Ecclestone with a look at his rise to power in F1. And it's a very interesting and varied story, with lots of early experiences that gave him the perfect grounding for what he'd eventually become. As you mentioned earlier, Matt, he had a rather inauspicious start to life, being born on the 28th of October, 1930, in the Suffolk village of St. Peter, to a fisherman, Sidney Ecclestone, and his wife, Bertha. Sidney caught herring and mackerel from a Lowestoft trawler and handed his earnings straight over to Bertha. Apparently they seldom spoke to each other. Their house had an outside lavatory and the family had no holidays. There was very little money around. When Bernie was 8 years old, the family moved to Dartford in Kent, where Sidney took a job as a crane driver and Bertha had her second child, a daughter called Marion. A year later, the Second World War began. They were living close to armaments factories, but even when the bombs started to drop on them, Bertha refused to evacuate her children to the countryside. So Bernie was able to watch the aerial dogfights conducted by RAF fighters based at Biggin Hill, an airfield he bought many years later, where F1's Technical Operations Centre is based now, and also where his priceless collection of historic Grand Prix cars is now kept. The war certainly disrupted his formal education, but there was a maths teacher who made an impression, and those lessons would stand him in good stead when he was negotiating deals in tens of millions of pounds.
Hundreds of millions of pounds in the end, I think.
Yes, they were.
They were, yeah. Anyway, Bernie was one of those kids who was always on the make. Apparently, at 11, the age of 11, he used to buy buns and bread rolls on his way to school at a penny halfpenny each in old money, which you will remember, as I do.
Yeah, I do.
Pre-1971 decimalisation, a penny halfpenny each, and he used to sell them when he got to school for twopence each. That's 33% markup, pretty hefty. And I think he continued in more or less the same vein, 33% markup minimum, for the next 85 years.
I wonder if every school year has a lad like Bernie. When I was about 16, we had one who sold us pills. He said they were Purple Hearts, amphetamines, to help us through exams, of course. He said they'd been specially manufactured to look like aspirins. Eventually, of course, we realised they were aspirins. Pure Bernie.
Pure Bernie, absolutely.
And to buy those profitable buns, Bernie invested his income from a paper round. I had a paper round when I was that age too, but I used the money to buy Buddy Holly records.
Pure Richard.
Thank you.
Anyway, Bernie left school more or less as soon as he could. Then, since he loved motorbikes, he got himself a job at Harcourt Motorcycles in Bexley Heath. When he was a kid, Bernie's father had a motorbike and sidecar. You'll remember those, won't you, Richard?
Yes, I do.
They were quite common,
Yes,
you know, a popular and cheap combination contraption in the 60s. I remember them when I was a kid. And as a young teenager, Bernie used to drag the bike part of his dad's motorbike sidecar contraption combination into the family's shed in what passed for a garden, and he used to practice taking it apart and putting it back together again. That way, he learned all about how motorbikes work. But at Harcourt Motorcycles, Ecclestone had bigger ideas than his boss, and still only 18 at this stage, Bernie marched into a nearby car dealership, also in Bexley Heath, Compton and Fuller, and asked the owner, Fred Compton, if he could rent some of his forecourt space on which to sell motorbikes. Compton told him to sling his hook, partly because, short of stature then, and indeed now, at 18, apparently Bernie looked about 15. So obviously, you know, a 15-year-old walking in to say, can I rent some forecourt space? No, sling your hook. But Ecclestone wouldn't take no for an answer, 18-year-old Ecclestone, that is, and after revisiting Compton's showroom repeatedly, apparently, finally Compton agreed. Now, Bernie had his own space on which to sell motorbikes and even a desk in an office inside, and soon young Ecclestone was selling many more motorbikes than Compton was selling cars. And by the time he was 20, Bernie had negotiated himself a share of the business, which was renamed Compton and Ecclestone, and it started selling motorbikes only. And it was then that Bernie began racing motorbikes himself, usually at nearby Brands Hatch. And he was known not so much for his incredible speed as for his immaculate leathers. However, he didn't enjoy crashing, which he did a few too many times apparently, finding his consequent hospital visits inconvenient, and not least because they interrupted his money-making. Anyway, so he tried four wheels instead, racing a 500cc Cooper Jack, and again, the car was immaculate, apparently, absolutely immaculate, but again, he was never among the very quickest. Much later, actually, he gave this quote to Motorsport magazine. "I've always been very competitive. I started racing push bikes, believe it or not. Then it was motorbikes and eventually cars, the old 500cc Cooper Japs. If you're a competitive person, you need something to satisfy that. The same in business. I was competing for the best deal for me and for other people. I won some races, I had some accidents, and in one of them at Brands Hatch someone got hurt in the crowd. In those days, safety was bits of string and some poles. I was a used car dealer, running a business, not a racing driver, so I stopped. Yeah, I won a few, but I finished up in hospital racing bikes. So, did I want to risk my life to become a racing driver? No, I didn't."
It's funny to think of him racing a bicycle, actually, but apparently he did ride at Herne Hill, the velodrome in South London, which was actually a venue for the 1948 Olympics.
Is that our first anorak fact?
That's an anorak fact.
It is.
And I'm interested in what you said about his immaculate motorcycle leathers, too. I wish we knew a bit more about his mother, because I suspect that's where he might have got his obsessive neatness from.
Well, that's an interesting point. And I think a surprisingly large number of super successful motorsport moguls, if we can call them that, they are rather like that, you know. I mean, obviously I worked for Ron Dennis for 10 years, and Ron Dennis was and still is like that, of course, you know, famously so. Roger Penske apparently is like that. And so is Toto Wolff today. Ron says, he's told me this, Ron says he got it from his mother. He remembers going to sleep as a child every night to the sound of the vacuum cleaner, which his mother ran around their modest house in Woking 2 or 3 times a day. Anyway, sorry, back to Bernie. Where were we?
Yeah. Well, you know, it was that obsession with neatness that made him insist that the giant trucks in the F1 paddock parking area weren't just lined up to the millimetre, but had their wheels spun round so that the tyre manufacturers' logos were perfectly aligned.
I remember that. Not only did he do that, but the maker's name was picked out in Tipex.
Exactly.
So that you could see the white against the black of the tyre.
And the registration plates had to be in order too, as they were parked down the car park.
So they did.
If I were a psychologist, I'd probably say that explains quite a lot about Bernie. And the first time I interviewed him for The Times in 1982, God, that's a long time ago, it was at his huge double-height penthouse in a block of apartments on the embankment of the Thames, opposite the Tate Gallery and the Houses of Parliament. He actually sold it to Geoffrey Archer, I think, afterwards.
That was where Geoffrey Archer had the shepherd's pie and Krug parties.
Indeed so.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't offered shepherd's pie and Krug by
No.
Bernie, I can tell you.
Quite fancy some after this this pod. Shall we do that?
Possibly.
Shepherd's pie and lager.
Anyway, it was the neatest place I've ever visited in my life, and that includes the McLaren headquarters in Ron Dennis's time.
And that was very neat.
Yep. And I wrote in the profile in the Times about Bernie that nowhere is there to be seen the common debris of human occupation. In other words, there were no newspapers lying around or crumbs in the shag pile carpet. But whatever the origins of that absolute rejection of mess and clutter, his instinct for a deal seems to have been there from birth. And the post-war used car business was where he honed its edge. It was a very sharp-elbowed business in those days, run by a lot of ruthless characters. And although he was very young, he became a significant figure, not just at the regular car auctions around the country, but particularly in Warren Street in Marylebone. That was where the London dealers congregated segregated in the 1950s, and these were men who weren't in the habit of taking prisoners. And his negotiating skills had already been noticed when Jack Surtees, John Surtees' dad, bought a 250cc Excelsior bike from the 17-year-old Bernie for the 12-year-old John to race. Jack Surtees said of Bernie, "That Ecclestone gets everyone bamboozled."
That's a great quote. And Bernie has continued to get everyone bamboozled ever since. Anyway, by the mid-50s, by which time Compton and Ecclestone was doing well, the dealership, selling a lot of motorbikes, Bernie had also bought 2 car dealerships, Hill's Garage in Bexleyheath and James Spencer Cars, also in Bexleyheath. He also bought the business that had given him his first job, Harcourt Motorcycles, so he was assembling a bit of an empire. He was making a name for himself as a big noise, although not a big chap, but a big noise in the Kent and South East London used car and motorbike scene. But he still loved his racing, and he continued to visit Brands Hatch, albeit now only as a spectator. And there it was in 1957, at 27 years old, that he began to hang out regularly with a young racing driver, Stuart Lewis Evans, who was also 27, and whom he, Bernie, had actually raced once or twice in his Cooper Jap back in the day. Now, Lewis Evans was quick. He'd actually made his Formula One Grand Prix debut at Monaco that year, 1957 I mean, in a Connaught, finishing 4th, pretty good, albeit, I have to say, 3 laps behind the flying Juan Manuel Fangio's winning Maserati. But still a good debut. Ecclestone then bought 2 Connaught cars when the Connaught team was disbanded.
Went bust, I think. Yeah,
it went bust.
Bernie probably got him cheap. Yeah.
Probably did. Well, he always did buy it cheap and sell it dear. Yep. But anyway, I'm sure he bought them cheap. And initially he'd hoped to run his mate Stuart Lewis Evans in Formula One in one of those Connaughts. But by that time, Stuart, having made his very good debut at Monaco, had been snapped up by Vanwall, for whom he raced in Formula One throughout 1957 and 1958. Stuart Lewis Evans did actually race the Connaught in a few non-championship Formula One races, though, in 57, including the Glover Trophy that year at Goodwood, which he won. Anyway, in 1958, Ecclestone was running the Connaught Formula One team, whose lack of success was frustrating him, truth be told, not least because his mate Lewis Evans was going great guns over at Vanwall. And at Monaco, for reasons that have never really been entirely clear to me, and maybe you, after I tell the little story, you'll be able to tell me whether they're clear to you. I don't know, but they've never been clear to me. Bernie jumped into one of the Connaughts and attempted to qualify it. Okay, he may not have been quick, Bernie, but he wasn't that slow. Not slow enough anyway to explain the fact that his qualifying lap time, was more than a minute off the pace. More than a minute.
Not a long circuit either.
Not a long circuit. And the pace was Tony Brooks's pole time in a Vanwall. But Bernie was still 55 seconds slower than the lap times set by the 2 regular Connaught drivers, not superstars themselves, Bruce Kessler and Paul Emery.
Only one of whom ever actually drove in a full Grand Prix.
There you go. There you go. Well,
anyway,
do you know why Bernie did that?
I have no idea why he would do that. But, Bernie, there must have been a motive for it.
There must have been a motive. Anyway, answers on a postcard, please, or a digital postcard. We'd be very interested. Anyway, Ecclestone has always been adamant that Lewis Evans was the real deal. He says he was as quick as Moss. And perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't. But Moss himself, Sterling Moss, the great Sterling Moss, described Lewis Evans as, quote, very, very fast, unquote. Well, from Moss, I think that's pretty tasty to be called very, very fast. Anyway, soon Bernie was acting as Stuart's unofficial manager. But it all came to a tragic end when Stuart Lewis Evans was mortally wounded in the last Grand Prix of the 1958 Formula One season, the Moroccan Grand Prix, as we described in last week's pod about Sterling Moss and Mike Hawthorne. And then Ecclestone turned his back on the motor racing scene. Now, what did he do? Some say he then went on to mastermind the Great Train Robbery of 1963, in which £2.6 million was snatched, which is, by the way, the equivalent of £70 million today. But it isn't true. The rumour isn't true. And actually, even though I knew it wasn't true, I once asked Bernie about it, actually, for an interview that I was writing for F1 Racing magazine, of which I was then the editor, about 25 years ago, I think it was. And the reason I asked him, I knew he hadn't done it, but I asked him because I thought his answer would be good value, and duly it was. His answer was, quote, "Why would I bother robbing a train that had only £2.6 million on it?" And he left it at that.
Was leaving just a scintilla of doubt in the air, I think.
But I think he liked that.
Of course.
He always liked that.
And even people who don't like him very much have to concede that Bernie does have a wicked sense of humour, even though it occasionally takes him well outside the track limits of political correctness.
Indeed so, exactly, yeah. Well put. But the truth was that after Lewis Evans had died, Ecclestone refocused his energies entirely on his businesses, and he also diversified into hire purchase, founding Arvin Securities and car auctions, founding Midweek Car Auctions. He was beginning to make serious money now.
Yeah, he certainly was. He was becoming a genuinely rich man, also through property deals and maybe other stuff we'll never know about. But
not train robberies.
Apparently not.
No.
But once again, he was pulled back into motorsport, this time as manager to the promising Austrian driver Jochen Rindt. So was he drawn back by a sheer love of racing, or did he see an unexploited sport as a route to becoming even richer? And I would say probably both.
And so would I.
Anyway, he and Rindt met properly in 1966 when Bernie took a trip to the Mexican Grand Prix with John Cooper and Roy Salvadori, two old friends from the 1950s racing scene. Salvadori was managing Cooper's Formula One team, running cars with V12 Maserati engines, rather handsome cars, I always thought.
Very much so.
For John Surtees and for Rindt, who was 23 and in his second full F1 season. Surtees won the race, but it was Rindt who impressed Ecclestone, and they struck up a friendship over games of backgammon, the rich man's board game.
Very much Bernie's favourite board game as well. And here's a coincidence, and our second Anorak fact of this pod. Young Bernie Ecclestone was at that 1966 Mexican Grand Prix, as you say, and so was another British youngster who would end up doing rather well in Formula One too. The Cooper team, who, as you say, Richard, were hosting Bernie for the race, well, they were fielding a fifth car. Yes, you could do that sort of thing in those days. You could run one car, two cars, any number of cars. Anyway, they were running 5 cars in Mexico that year, and the fifth car was for local man Moises Solana. Now, of course, they needed an extra mechanic for Solana, who was paying for the drive, so they flew out a 19-year-old greenhorn from Surrey by the name of Ronald Dennis. Yes, Ron Dennis. It was Ron's first ever Formula One Grand Prix, and actually the first time he'd been outside the UK too, although he did tell me he had been on a ferry to the Isle of Wight.
So there was one man already part of the way to becoming unfeasibly rich, and the other just starting out.
Exactly.
And while young Ron was tightening bolts and wiping up spilt oil, Bernie was becoming Rindt's manager, guiding him as he spent another season with Cooper and then one with Brabham. Those 2 seasons weren't good. 24 races, 18 retirements. But then, for 1969, he signed with Colin Chapman, whose Lotus 49s were sponsored by Players Gold Leaf cigarettes and looked rather nice in the livery too.
Very nice, very nice.
And in the next to last race of the year at Watkins Glen, Rindt won his first Grand Prix from pole position after a battle with the matter of his great friend Jackie Stewart, who was the newly crowned world champion. And there was better and worse to come in 1970. Rindt won at Monaco in the 49 before the slippery new Lotus 72 arrived. That was a game changer. And also painted in the red and white livery of gold leaf, the 72 took him to Grand Prix wins at Zandvoort, Clermont-Ferrand, Brands Hatch and Hockenheim. Here's what Bernie said about him. Quote, Jochen was the most talented driver I'd ever seen. And remember, Bernie went back to Fangio.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moss, Clark, all those. Quote, I looked after him and we shared the money. It was fun. Jochen was fun. He could have gone to Brabham in 1970, and I told him he had a better chance of winning the title with Lotus, although he had more chance of getting hurt. Unquote. And those words proved sadly prophetic when they got to Monza, with Rindt holding a solid lead in the Drivers' Championship. In one of the practice sessions, as he started to brake from top speed for the Parabolica at the end of the back straight, the right front brake shaft failed. The car turned straight into the barriers, which were badly secured. And he'd set off without doing up his crotch straps, which was his habit, because he thought it would let him get out faster if the car caught fire. But what actually happened was that the car's nose went through those badly secured barriers and hit a supporting post. And as Rindt slid down in the cockpit, not held by the lower belts, the straps that he had fastened effectively garroted him.
Ghastly accident.
Terrible.
Terrible.
And Bernie was in the pits at the time, and he ran across and down the track to the scene of the crash. He came back holding Jochen's helmet, having lost another driver who was also a close friend. A month later, after the United States Grand Prix, Rindt's points total was enough for him to be named world champion, the only one in the sport's history to win the title posthumously.
Am I one of many people probably listening to this who first learned the meaning of the word posthumous because of reading about Jochen Rindt?
Very likely.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt either that if he hadn't been killed, he would have gone on to be a multiple champion.
Yes.
And several people who followed him wouldn't have been multiple champions because of that.
Indeed.
So did Bernie, his manager, feel guilty for advising him to go to Lotus? Almost certainly not. All the drivers, including Rindt, knew about the Lotus reputation for fragility, but they also knew that Chapman's cars had carried Jim Clark and Graham Hill to the title, and that must have seemed like a gamble worth taking. And in the years to come, it certainly didn't discourage, Emerson Fittipaldi, Ronnie Peterson, Mario Andretti. But was Bernie affected by the tragedy? Undoubtedly.
Undoubtedly, yes. Although he's always discussed these things. Let me put it this way. He's always discussed these things. I mean, Jochen Rindt, Stuart Lewis Evans and so on, very phlegmatically. But yes, it had happened again. It being the driver he'd been managing and around whom he'd been planning his next moves in Formula One, don't forget, had been killed. Stuart Lewis Evans in 1958 and Jochen Rindt in 1970. But apart from being quick and working with Bernie, Lewis, Evans and Rindt were very different. For a start, Rindt wasn't just quick, he was super quick. Proper quick. But he was also very clever, very sharp. I've often thought that had he lived, yes, as you say, Richard, he may well have gone on to win multiple world championships, Rindt, but perhaps it might not have been Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley who went on to rule Formula One in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, but Bernie Ecclestone and Jochen Rindt. But again, tragedy intervened.
An interesting thought. And that feels like a good time for ad break number 1.
Christine, have you ever bought something and thought, wow, this product actually made my life better?
Totally. And usually I find those products through Wirecutter.
Yeah, but you work here.
Yeah, that's true. I do. We both do. We're the hosts of The Wirecutter Show from the New York Times.
It's our job to research, test, and vet products, and then recommend our favorites.
For instance, Kyra, I think you've slept on 40 mattresses?
Yep. And Christine, you've tested everything from blenders to linen sheets.
Oh, I love linen sheets.
And we're bringing all of this expertise to The Wirecutter Show. Each week, we'll talk to someone from our team of 140 journalists about the very best product picks in every category.
Plus, tips, tricks, and hacks that go beyond the products. Because we don't just want to recommend great gear. We want to solve your everyday problems. And trust me, we have the expertise to do just that.
Listen to The Wirecutter Show, hosted by me, Kyra Blackwell.
And me, Christine Cyr-Clisette. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Welcome back. So, by the end of 1970, Bernie Ecclestone had been involved in Formula One on and off for around 13 or 14 years. He'd experienced life as an entrant and team owner, and as a driver manager, and even one fine day as a driver who failed to qualify for the Monaco Grand Prix. But as we've said, he'd also experienced significant tragedy and the painful loss of two friends. Now, after the second of those, Jochen Rindt's death in 1970, he might have disappeared. I mean, Bernie might have disappeared from the racing scene altogether, as he had done when Stuart Lewis Evans had been killed in 1958. But this time he didn't. Instead, he returned to the team ownership side of things, didn't he, Richard?
Yes, he once said, "I don't make plans, never have. I take opportunities."
Very Bernie comment.
Very Bernie. And midway through 1971, just after his 40th birthday, an opportunity arose when he began talking to Ron Tauranac, the owner of the Brabham team. Tauranac had co-founded a company called Motor Racing Developments with his fellow Australian, Jack Brabham, in 1960, at first making customer cars for lower series and then designing and building F1 Brabhams, which Brabham himself drove.
Indeed.
And they were World Championship cars.
Yeah.
And after Jack retired at the end of 1970, Tauranac became the sole owner, but he quickly realised it wasn't quite as much fun without his friend by his side. Plus, he described himself as useless at finding sponsors, which was becoming increasingly necessary.
Absolutely.
Enter Bernie. At first, Bernie wanted to form a partnership with Tauranac, but Ron wasn't interested in another partnership. He just wanted to design cars. So he offered to sell the team in whole to Bernie at asset value, which he estimated at £130,000. And then we get a glimpse of Bernie the businessman. According to Tauranac, at the 11th hour, Bernie dropped the price he was prepared to pay down to £100,000. And speaking to Motorsport magazine in 2014, Tauranac said, quote, "I wasn't a smart businessman. I should have said, look, Bernie, you can't go back on your word. We agreed on this. But I thought about it for 3 minutes and agreed." The other thing I've only just realised after reading various accounts from England is that we had £50,000 in the bank. That should have been added as an asset, or I should have drawn it out. But I didn't do any of those things, unquote. So Bernie made another 50 grand.
It's
and
surprising
Tauranac
that Bernie didn't say, "Oh, just let you know, there's 50 grand. I should be..."
Would you like it back? So anyway, Tauranac had seen Bernie's negotiating skills at first hand, and he soon saw Bernie's ruthless side too. Tauranac's deal with Ecclestone included him staying on as designer, but one day he turned up at work to find another designer, a guy called Colin Seeley, with whom Bernie had previously built motorbikes, sitting at his desk. And soon after that, Tauranac's paychecks stopped arriving at home.
Well, Bernie always... he wasn't a shrinking violet in those ways, to be fair. Never has been. Anyway, going back to the finance side of things, one thing we should say is that obviously by today's standards, £100,000 is, it's next to nothing to pay for a Formula One team. The equivalent today would be just under £2 million.
Of that £100,000.
Of that £100,000, yes. So that's £2 million. But it would cost you around 500 times more than that to buy a current Formula One team with a guaranteed Formula One entry.
And that wouldn't be Ferrari or Mercedes, would it?
It would not. But, they are £1 billion franchises now. That's what a Formula One team is. But at the time, £100,000 was a hell of a lot of money. And thanks to all his business dealings, Bernie did have it to hand. And, maybe the fact that he appeared to find it so easy to lay his hands on comparatively large sums of money was why he became linked to the great train robbery, as I described earlier. As I say, it was a wild rumour, and of course it wasn't true, but I think people enjoyed spreading it, and in a way, even Bernie himself didn't mind allowing it to gain traction.
No, it sort of blew a bit of smoke around his reputation.
Exactly.
Mr. E.
Yeah, exactly. The Mr. E mythos was beginning. And for instance, how about these anorak facts which show that he wasn't averse to allowing that mythos or myth to spread? Two of the great train robbers were Roy James and Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie Biggs, much more famous, of course. Roy James, nicknamed the Weasel, was a racing driver, quickish in Formula Libre, by all account, I'm told. And he it was who drove the getaway car, or one of the getaway cars, in the great train robbery. And while Roy James, was in prison, he learned to be a silversmith. And when he came out, for a while, Ecclestone gave him the task of engraving the winners' names on the winners' trophies for Formula One Grand Prix. Amazing. Whenever I see not whenever, but sometimes when I see a late 1970s podium, which I do see a lot because I love reading and looking at pictures of that era, I often wonder whether the winner's trophy that's being hoisted triumphantly aloft by the likes of, Niki Lauda, Mario Andretti, Ronnie Peterson, Jody Scheckter, Carlos Reutemann et al., whether they carry the engravings of the so-called Weasel. And years after Ronnie Biggs had escaped from Wandsworth Prison in London, which he did in 1965, to become a fugitive from British justice in Rio de Janeiro, Ecclestone would sometimes give him a paddock pass in the 1980s when the Brazilian Grand Prix was held in Rio.
For old time's sake, do you think?
Maybe. Very Bernie again. Just allowing the legend to be spread.
Yeah. And it's said that the Weasel used cat burglary as well as getaway driving as means to fund his racing career. Apparently he once stole a Jaguar belonging to Mike Hawthorne, the 1958 world champion, who we featured in our last pod. And according to the journalist Joe Sayward, Roy James used the car belonging to Hawthorne for a robbery and then left it parked near a celebrated racing club so that it would be returned to Mike.
Incredible. Honour among thieves.
Well, however Bernie made his money, he did buy Brabham for £100,000 and he did start running it his way. Early on, he made the decision to close the side of the business that made racing cars for outside customers in order to concentrate the team's resources on the Formula One side. And he made sure the Brabhams looked the part too. You'll remember whether they carried sponsorship from Martini, Parmalat or Olivetti. Between 1972 and 1987, they had the smartest livery on the grid, and they were immaculately prepared by a group of talented mechanics whose loyalty would later be rewarded when Bernie moved on to higher things.
Absolutely. Those cars were gorgeous.
They were. They
gorgeous.
Were, yes, absolutely. Even when they weren't particularly quick.
Yes.
Never mind winning championships. They looked great.
The colourway, the way the logos were, the numbers. Do you remember that typeface, the 5s and 6s in the late 70s?
Yep. Like a kind of computer typeface.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yes, but very handsome. But perhaps the biggest move he made early on in his tenure as the team's owner was to promote the young South African designer Gordon Murray to chief designer ahead of the 1973 season, when Murray was only 26 years old.
Yes, and as I'm sure listeners or regular listeners will recognise Murray's name from the Colossally episode that we made not long ago about McLaren winning Le Mans in 1995, because he it was, Murray, who designed the McLaren F1 road car. But before all that, Gordon Murray, had made his name at Brabham under Bernie Ecclestone. And one thing that Ecclestone and Murray had in common was that they liked to push the envelope. I mean, anyone successful in Formula One likes to push the envelope, but they definitely did. And they weren't afraid of bending the rules or, let's say, edging into grey areas when it suited them. Bernie's first victory as a team boss was the 1974 South African Grand Prix, when my childhood hero, Carlos Reutemann, scored the first of 3 victories for him that season in the Gordon Murray-designed BT44, which was and is a real beauty, absolute beauty. But although the cars were quick and, as I say, beautiful, and they won a few Formula One Grand Prix in 1974 and 1975, the Brabham team's fortunes took a bit of a nosedive in 1976. Bernie had done a deal whereby the strong and reliable bulletproof Cosworth DFV V8 engines that Brabham had been running successfully in 74 and 75 and before, but winning in 74 and 75, as I say, he did the deal that they were replaced by Alfa Romeo Flat 12s, which were powerful, yes, and had been successful in sports cars, as you'll know and remember, Richard, but also heavy and unreliable. And as a result, the 1976 season was a disaster, and before the end of it, Reutemann had left for Ferrari. The Brabham Alpha was much improved for 1977, sometimes very quick actually, especially in the hands of Reutemann's replacement, John Watson, but it was still unreliable. But much worse, also in 1977, Ecclestone had to cope with yet another tragedy, because yet another driver he was close to, this time Carlos Pache, was killed. This time in a light aircraft accident, not in a racing accident, a light aircraft accident. And actually, Bernie once said, quote, "If Carlos Pache had lived, I'd never have needed Niki Lauda," unquote. High praise indeed, isn't it?
Yes, you were a Reutemann fan. I was a bit of a Pache fan, actually.
Well, I was a bit of a Pache fan as well, but I was more of a Reutemann fan.
Well, great helmet design, Pache. Anyway, sad loss. But even before Bernie became a team owner, he'd seen the opportunity offered by a very undeveloped sport. By taking over Brabham, he'd bought himself a seat at the table of the Formula One Constructors Association, an organisation founded by Colin Chapman in the 60s. It didn't have much in the way of organisation or influence, and Bernie set about changing that. In fact, over the next 10 years, he'd turn it into the most powerful body in the sport. At that time, each team negotiated their terms separately with the individual race organisers. Bernie saw that collective bargaining, trade union style, could give them strength and a guarantee of enhanced income.
Good socialist, Bernie Ecclestone.
Oh, always. Always. Power to the people. His people.
Wolfie Ecclestone. Will anybody know what that means?
No.
But you do.
And here's what he said, quote, "The team owners came to me and asked me to help get things properly organised on their behalf. It needed doing. The finances were in a mess. Sometimes they never got paid, and they needed someone to represent them, get a better deal. And I took a percentage." He knew that the FIA, the world governing body, and its sporting commission, then called the CSI, favoured continental F1 teams like Ferrari, Alfa Romeo and Renault over the British teams, whom they saw as rather scruffy arrivistes, not proper manufacturers. But he also knew that without Lotus, Brabham, McLaren and so on, the series would collapse. So he and his pal Max Mosley, a qualified barrister who'd been a co-founder of the March team, laid the foundations for a takeover and prepared themselves for a long, strategically complex and sometimes bloody battle to achieve it. And after a lot of skirmishing, the big step came in 1978, when Bernie was made chief executive of the Constructors Association. That made him one of the most powerful men in F1 and placed him in direct opposition to the newly appointed head of the CSI, which was soon to be renamed FISA, F-I-S-A, Jean-Marie Balestre. And Mosley became FOCA's legal advisor. Matt, how significant a moment was this?
It was a very significant moment because this was Ecclestone flexing his political muscles in Formula One for the first time and being trusted by his fellow team owners to do that. But the danger, of course, was that Bernie might at some point face a conflict of interests situation or accusation, given that he was also still running a racing team, Brabham, whose aim and purpose was still to beat all the others. And in fact, that moment did indeed come at the Swedish Grand Prix in 1978 when Brabham debuted, how do you pronounce that word? Debuted its notorious fan car, the BT46B. Designed by Gordon Murray, the car was a classic example of a designer exploiting the grey areas of the regulations, as we've said. It featured a huge fan on the back of the car, quite crude actually, driven by the car's powerful Alfa Romeo Flat 12, which, by the way, had become pretty reliable by 1978, as it happens. Anyway, Murray preempted complaints from rival teams by claiming that the fan was there for cooling purposes. But really, its purpose was to create downforce, which it did by extracting air from beneath the car to create a massive suction ground effect. And as such, it was actually a more effective ground effect car than the first ever ground effect car in Formula One, the Lotus 79, which until the Brabham fan car had come along had been the fastest car on the grid in 1978, and actually by a long chalk. You know, Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson winning and recording 1-2 finishes and so on and so forth. So the Brabham fan car was extremely quick, and Niki Lauda duly drove it to an easy-peasy win at Anderstorp in Sweden that year. However, that would be the car's only appearance in a World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix. After that, Bernie locked it away, and now it sits in his pristine warehouse at Biggin Hill, along with dozens of other priceless Grand Prix and Formula One cars, as you've already mentioned, Richard. It's popularly thought that the fan car was banned, actually, but it wasn't at all, was it?
No, it was a bit more complicated than that. After the race, the stewards deemed the car legal, and later the governing body also accepted Brabham's claim, maybe the most disingenuous in the history of F1, that the fan wasn't a movable aerodynamic device and that its primary effect was to cool the engine.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. And that met the letter, if not the spirit of the rules. But there was, however, still a problem for Bernie because he'd upset his fellow teams.
Yes, and having just been appointed chief executive of FOCA, as we've said, the Formula One Constructors Association, Ecclestone must have feared that something like that could potentially cause a fracture to the unity of the association. And according to Gordon Murray, who wasn't overly pleased that the fan car was withdrawn, it was Bernie who decided to withdraw it from competition, thereby preserving harmony among the rest of the teams. Richard, was the fan car, or the withdrawal of the fan car, the whole fan car saga, a good example of Bernie seeing the bigger picture and thinking long-term, do you think? I mean, he always had a habit of being one step ahead.
Well, like a good poker player, he knew when to hold 'em and when to fold 'em. And he came out of the fan car episode looking as though he'd acted in the best interests of the sport.
He did. How selfless.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop Brabham pushing the rules. In 1981, only 3 years later, the team were accused of running an underweight chassis. It was alleged that they fitted heavier bodywork and/or wings for the pre-race scrutineering, replacing them with lighter components for the race, and then quickly reinstalling them for the post-race check. Nothing was ever proved on that front, but with Brabham's Nelson Piquet winning that year's championship, suspicions remain to this day.
Yes, that was a good example of something that Ecclestone was accused or suspected of doing, but there was never any proof, as you say. Although there are scurrilous rumours of Brabham mechanics occasionally being spotted wilting, struggling under the heavy weight of their car's front wings, which of course should have been lightweight. Anyway, here's another example of alleged jiggery-pokery from that year too. For years, the family of Carlos Reutemann has suspected some kind of foul play in the 1981 World Championship decider at Las Vegas, where Reutemann, a Williams driver, and Brabham's Nelson Piquet were vying for the title. Now, Reutemann qualified his Williams on the pole, but inexplicably he slid backwards in the race to P8, 8th, despite the fact that his Williams teammate, whom he'd out-qualified, Alan Jones, won the race easily. And Ecclestone admitted fairly recently that he had indeed tried to manipulate the result of that race. In the documentary about Bernie Ecclestone's life, which is entitled Lucky, Bernie said, quote, "After the first day of practice, it was obvious the drivers were going to have problems with neck pain. Carlos was speaking to the masseur in the pits. I went to see that person, and after a financial discussion, they decided to favour Nelson instead." Very Bernie. "We won the championship," he means Brabham, "we won the championship, and that was the end for Carlos, who stopped racing soon after. I don't know if I ever told him that." End quote. Look, quite what that means, I'm not sure. On social media, a lot of people have sprung on that, particularly Argentine fans, to say, aha, that means that Reutemann should have won the World Championship in 1981, and perhaps he should. But knowing Bernie, it may not even have been exactly true. As we've said, he's always loved playing games with the media, playing games with journalists, and why would he not play games on his own documentary? The long-running saga about whether or not he may have been mixed up in the Great Train Robbery was an example of that, as we've said a couple of times already on the pod. And, of course, he's made countless provocative remarks in media interviews, frequently for the sheer fun of it, I've always thought. So, really, we're probably none the wiser about 1981, are we?
No, honestly, Reutemann's off day was very puzzling, to say the least, and still is. But I do think that stuff about the masseur is a bit off the wall. Even though actually was a new circuit in a car park in Caesar's Palace and had a lot of tight bends, so maybe. But anyway, there you go. We'll never.
Yeah, but he was on the pole handsomely,
He was, it's true.
But I agree with you. Personally, I doubt that it's entirely true. I mean, I doubt that the rumour that Bernie nobbled the masseur and that manipulated the
Bernie's
champion.
rumour that he nobbled the masseur.
Yeah, yes. I personally, if you were going to make me, make a bet, I would say that probably isn't true. And the 1981 World Championship was not manipulated by Bernie in that way. Call me naive if you like. Anyway,
Naive.
Naive. Well, there you are.
And of course, Bernie revealed that only a few months after Reutemann's death. Anyway, the following year, 1982, Bernie and the team would again become embroiled in a political contretemps, sparked once again by Gordon Murray testing the spirit, if not the wording, of the regulations. Essentially, to help Brabham compete against the more powerful turbo Ferraris and Renaults, Brabham tried to enhance the weight advantage of their normally aspirated engine cars by using water as ballast to meet the minimum weight requirement. The Williams team used a similar system, actually, possibly in collusion with Brabham, because Bernie and Frank Williams were close and fighting the same corner. At the time, that minimum weight limit included all of the car's fluids, such as fuel, oil and water, and the rules allowed those fluids to be topped up before post-race checks were complete. So Brabham and Williams fitted extra water tanks, which they filled to pass the pre-race weight checks, and then they shed the water once the race started, and effectively ran the whole Grand Prix underweight, before taking advantage of the right to top up the tanks ahead of the post-race scrutineering. Brabham and Williams said the water was to cool the brakes, but no one was really buying that. And in any case, the ruse didn't last long, with matters coming to a head at round 2 of the 1982 championship in Brazil, where Renault and Ferrari protested Nelson Piquet's winning Brabham and Keke Rosberg's second-placed Williams. The FISA later upheld the protest, disqualifying Piquet and Rosberg and presenting the win to Renault's Alain Prost, which, however justified it might have been, did nothing to quell the suspicions of Bernie and the other FOCA teams that the FISA was biased towards the so-called manufacturer teams of Ferrari, Renault and Alfa Romeo.
Yeah. That was one of the major flashpoints of the so-called FISA-FOCA war, in which Ecclestone and his right-hand man Mosley were major players. But ironically enough, only one race earlier, at the season opener in South Africa, Kyalami, Ecclestone and Jean-Marie Balestre, obviously the FIA president, had been united when the drivers had gone on strike over a new clause inserted by FISA into their super licenses. Of course, it was very rare that Ecclestone and Balestra were ever on the same side. In fact, Bernie and Max took the mickey out of Balestra mercilessly, often behind his back all the time. And, he was very pompous, Balestra, so taking the mickey out of him was an easy game. By the way, Ecclestone and Moseley called him Gene Mary. Always called him Gene Mary.
I wonder who leaked that famous photograph of Balestra in a Nazi uniform during the war. Anyway, that's by the by.
We may never know.
We may
never know. But he was a very pompous person, with the motorbike outriders and French flags and FIA and FISA flags on the car, all that stuff. Anyway, back to Brazil. The Brazil disqualifications brought disharmony, and lots of it. In protest, Bernie and Max organised a boycott by the FOCA teams of the 1982 San Marino Grand Prix, round 4 of that year's Formula One World Championship. 4 of the FOCA teams, Tyrrell, Ozella, ATS and Tolman, broke that boycott, citing so-called sponsor obligations. Yeah, right. But even so, there were only 14 cars on the grid at Imola, just 14, with the likes of Brabham, Williams, McLaren, March and Lotus all staying away. Now, that was an embarrassment for FISA, even if the home crowd did get the Ferrari 1-2 finish they came for, albeit a rather controversial one, Richard, I think we could agree, but that's another podcast. Anyway, it wasn't the first time that Bernie and Max had used strength in numbers in opposition to FISA. In fact, the FISA-FOCA war had been raging for several years. Matters had first come to a head at the 1980 Spanish Grand Prix. For the previous rounds, Belgium and Monaco, the FOCA teams had instructed their drivers to boycott the mandatory driver briefings held by FISA in protest against the distribution of event revenue. Now, FISA President Jean-Marie Balestra issued $2,000 fines to drivers who failed to attend those briefings, and he said he'd revoke the racing licenses of anyone who didn't pay those fines. Well, that was just the kind of cat and mouse game that Bernie and Max loved, wasn't it? So what did they do? They threatened to withdraw all 12 FOCA teams from the event, raising the possibility of there being just 6 cars on the grid. And I think we all know from the 2005 United States Grand Prix at Indianapolis many, many years later, we all know how badly a grid reduced to just 6 cars goes down with punters and press, don't we? Anyway, back to Spain. The Royal Automobile Club of Spain, who organised the race, offered to pay the drivers' fines, but FISA refused, instead saying that they wanted the teams to pay up and admit their guilt. So what happened next? A royal intervention. Juan Carlos I, the King of Spain, ordered the race to take place, but it was no longer sanctioned by FISA, and as a result, the 3 manufacturer teams withdrew. In the end, the 1980 Spanish Grand Prix did indeed go ahead, won by Williams' Alan Jones, but no World Championship points were awarded. I mean, could you imagine something like that happening today, Richard?
Well, I'd hesitate to suggest that it couldn't, because, as the man whose famous phrase gave our podcast its title also once said, in Formula One, anything can happen, and it usually does.
And in case anyone doesn't know whom Richard is referring to, it's the one and only Murray Walker, of course.
Yeah, and in answer to your question, I can certainly say that it's much less likely to happen, and that's thanks to the creation of the first Concord Agreement between the FIA and the F1 teams, signed by Ecclestone and Balestra in January 1981, although Bernie actually claims it was signed 6 months earlier, and he and Balestra kept it quiet to keep the media guessing.
It's interesting. I didn't know that.
Mischievous little chaps.
Yeah, yes.
So why was it called the Concord Agreement? Because it was signed in the FIA offices overlooking the Place de la Concorde in Paris, where the guillotine had done such effective business during the French Revolution 2 centuries earlier. No connection.
None whatever.
The word Concord, of course, works equally well in French and English, the 2 prime languages then, probably and now, of Formula One. referring to, quote, a state in which people or things agree with each other and exist together in a peaceful way. And we're assured that its use in a Formula One context was not ironic.
Yes.
So the first Concord Agreement saw the FISA agreeing to a fairer distribution of revenue to all teams and a set timetable for changes to the technical regulations so no team could gain any advantage. And in return, all the teams agreed to appear at every race thereafter and to abide by the rules set out by the governing body. That bit about all the teams promising to compete in every race was crucial, actually, because FOCA, i.e. Bernie, had been given the right to negotiate TV contracts, and Bernie's great piece of crystal ball gazing was to see that TV held the key to the sport's growth and future prosperity. And he knew that big TV deals would only be possible if he could guarantee broadcasters A, a stable calendar, and B, a complete grid at every race. But actually the signing of the initial agreement, which was to run until 1987, didn't really calm things down that much, because pretty soon F1 found itself with the upheaval at San Marino in 1982, which we've already mentioned.
What's interesting about the FISA-FOCA war, in hindsight, to me at least, is that Bernie and Max were on the other side of the fence in a similar argument in 2008, many years later, when FOTA, not FOCA, but FOTA, FOTA, the Formula One Teams Association, which was a follow-up organisation to FOCA and was formed at a team meeting in Maranello, so involving Ferrari, Luca Montezemolo as well, in July 2008, threatened a breakaway series of its own, while in dispute with Formula One management and the FIA. And not for this pod, but I'll share some of my memories of working for McLaren during that period in the next episode, in the next pod.
Motor racing loves its acronyms, doesn't it? FIA, FISA, FOCA, FOTA, FOMA.
All of them.
If your head is spinning, I don't blame you.
Yes. Anyway, how important do you think the FISA-FOCA war was in terms of shaping Bernie Ecclestone, the political animal and future ruler of Formula One? I mean, for one thing, it strengthened his alliance with Max Mosley, who'd go on to be FIA president. But there might have been other things. Tell us what you think.
Well, that was the key partnership. You couldn't call Max and Bernie good cop and bad cop, but in terms of negotiations, Max was the silver-tongued persuader and Bernie was the fist in the pocket with a knuckle duster at the ready.
That's interesting. I've always used a different, but actually very similar metaphor. I've always said that Ecclestone was the iron fist in Mosley's velvet glove.
Oh, yours is much better.
It's not at all. But they are similar, aren't they?
They are. And actually, when I was writing the piece I mentioned for The Times in 1982, in the middle of the FISA-FOCA hostilities, a contact said to me, quote, "The thing about Bernie is that everyone in Grand Prix racing is scared of him. They're afraid to step out of line," unquote. That was in 1982, and the fact that my contact demanded to remain anonymous, well, that told its own story.
Yes. I've actually seen a team principal, an acting team principal who was in charge of a Formula One team at the time, physically hiding from Bernie Ecclestone in the past, literally crouching. Shall I tell this? Yeah, well, I will. Literally crouching behind a fridge at the back of his motorhome to avoid Bernie, whom he knew he'd recently antagonised. Shall I say who it was, Richard?
Yes, please go on.
I've kind of got to now, haven't I? Okay, why not? It was Eddie Jordan.
Wow.
And that feels like a good time for our final ad break.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC. This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
So, before the break, we talked in detail about the FISA-FOCA war and Bernie's role in it. But of course, he was still the owner of Brabham during that period. And in 1983, his team won the World Championship with Nelson Piquet for a second time. And, anorak fact, Matt, that was the first driver's title won with a turbo-powered car. In this case, the ludicrously powerful BT52 BMW.
What a, I'm going to say, sexy car that was.
Yeah, and the engine was quite funny too. Do you remember the story about that? It was a 4-cylinder engine.
Yes, I know.
And it was with a cast iron block. And when they cast it, they had to cure the metal, the block. And the only way to do it was with urine. So the BMW engineers...
Listeners, you didn't see the face I made then.
And the BMW guys used to have to take them outside, put it in the grass or somewhere and pee on it.
Whatever works.
So I was told.
Well, can I just say, McLaren used gold to win the 1995 Le Mans 24 Hours.
They did.
And Brabham used pee to win the World Championship in 1983.
Takes all sorts.
Anorak fact.
So... Bernie was exercising his power on and off the track, and he was becoming an increasingly important figure, and eventually the most important figure in the paddock. We mentioned it already briefly, but one of the big things Bernie got stuck into was TV rights. He wanted every race to be screened live on TV in as many markets as possible. He knew the commercial value of a global fan base to potential sponsors. And to be clear, before Bernie got involved, Formula One TV rights were a mess. He wanted to make it so that in a given country, a single major broadcaster would cover every round of the World Championship, such as the BBC in the UK or Rai in Italy, which was a very astute move. Matt, when you look back, securing the rights for FOCA to negotiate TV deals was a massive coup for Bernie, wasn't it?
It was huge, yes. And ultimately it gave him great, great power because he could essentially control the vast amounts of money that the TV deals would generate. And money is power. I mean, just do the maths, or the math, as they say in the States. Let me put it this way. When I arrived in Formula One as a journalist in the early 1990s, it was already a hugely popular sport. It was broadcast on live TV in most countries in the world. Well, let's say there's about 190 countries in the world, so let's say it was broadcast in 150 countries, let's say, for the sake of argument. Well, I remember when ITV took over the TV rights to broadcast Formula One in 1997, replacing the BBC. And I think ITV had to pay Ecclestone £70 million for those rights. 5 years later, the BBC bought the same TV rights back for £175 million. As I say, do the maths, or the math. Okay, not every country's TV broadcasters were paying as much as, the UK's, ITV and BBC were, but even if they were paying a quarter, or a fifth, multiply it by 150 countries. Bernie and or Formula One management were making huge amounts of money, huge. But Ecclestone was by the way, I'm not begrudging that. It was earned and the sport was becoming huge globally. Anyway, Ecclestone was interested in the TV product itself as well, not just the money associated with it. In fact, he was instrumental in the introduction of a number of things, onboard cameras in Formula One being just one example. And in fact, here's an anorak fact for you about that. The first race to feature an onboard camera transmitting live TV footage was the 1985 German Grand Prix, the camera attached to the side of François Hinault's Renault.
Which lasted only 8 laps before its clutch went. but no matter. It was a good idea, and it did catch on. And the TV deals brought in a lot of money, as we've said, and that kept the teams happy and strengthened Bernie's hand, both politically and financially. But we should probably say at this point that apart from accumulating power and money, Bernie was also concerned with improving driver safety. Of course, a cynic might say he thought driver fatalities weren't great for the TV audience.
That's actually a good point, Richard. I mean, Sid Watkins, Formula One's legendary professor, neurosurgeon, safety delegate, tends to get the lion's share of the credit for the great advances in Formula One safety that we've seen over the years, and rightly so. Max Mosley, too, actually. But Bernie Ecclestone's contribution is often overlooked. It shouldn't be.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier the impact that the deaths of Lewis Evans and Rindt had on him. So perhaps that's why in 1978, when he was installed as chief executive of FOCA, he personally brought in Professor Watkins to help make F1 safer. Actually, it was another controversial character. Do you remember Lou Stanley, the team principal
Indeed.
Of BRM in the 60s and 70s, larger-than-life chap, who'd created and funded F1's first full proper medical unit in 1968. And I guess he was encouraged by Jackie Stewart, who was driving for BRM at the time.
Almost certainly.
But Bernie took it further. He'd met Sid Watkins, who'd been spending some of his time off as a race doctor at Silverstone and elsewhere, and he offered him a season-long role in F1, attending all the races. And then after Ronnie Peterson's fatal accident at Monza in 1978, when Sid was prevented by the Italian police from reaching the victim, he got Bernie to ensure that in future he'd have full and unimpeded access, along with a medical car, an anaesthetist and a helicopter available for emergency transfers to a nearby hospital, where the staff would be on alert throughout the race weekend. That was a big step. And it was largely Bernie's initiative.
Yes, it was. And by the way, I mean, en passant, I must say, we really must do a Ronnie Peterson podcast one day, mustn't we? Because he was as quick as anyone who ever raced a Formula One car, ever. And his story deserves a pod of its own. And his death was such a tragedy.
Yeah, correct.
Unnecessary tragedy.
It was.
Yeah.
Correct. And we will.
We will. Anyway, back to Bernie. We're actually coming towards the end of this first of our 2 Bernie Ecclestone podcast episodes now. But before we end, we need to wrap up how Bernie went from, if I can say, pulling double time as a team owner and FOCA chief executive to becoming Formula One's full-time ringmaster in chief. Well, the key moment came in 1987 when the second Concord Agreement was drawn up. It was at that point that Ecclestone established what became known as Formula One Management, or FOM, another one of these acronyms that you've been talking about, Richard. Although when it was set up, it was known as FOPA, F-O-P-A, Formula One Promotions and Administration. The role of FOPA was to manage TV rights and race promoter fees, and in return pay the team's prize money, based on World Championship results, which actually is essentially the same structure as we have today. Of course, FOPA also negotiated the right to keep a good deal of the revenue for itself.
Yeah, and by this stage, Brabham's performance had dropped off a cliff, hastened by the departures of Gordon Murray to McLaren and Nelson Piquet to Williams, though you could probably say that Bernie's eye was on other priorities at that stage too. In 1988, he sold the team to a Swiss businessman, Joachim Lüthi, who kept it going with ever more undistinguished results until the end of 1992. And after handing his Damon Hill his F1 debut, it folded. If you remember, we noted earlier how Bernie had bought Brabham for £100,000 off Ron Toronac in 1971. 17 years later, he got $5 million for it. His old mates winding back the clocks on second-hand cars in Warren Street would have been proud of him.
They would indeed. Hey, that feels like a good place to end this week's episode. So next week, when we return, we'll pick up the story by talking about Bernie's close to 40-year reign as Formula One's most powerful figure. There's absolutely loads to get into.
Yeah, including the stories of getting some of us getting stuck in the car parks at Silverstone and whenever it was.
Easter Sunday.
On Easter Sunday, entirely Bernie's doing. And we may veer into football with his adventures with Flavio Briatore at Queen's Park Rangers. Indeed so, yeah.
And various other escapades and errors,
indeed.
none of them politically correct.
None of them. And we hope you've enjoyed this first part of our Bernie doubleheader. As ever, we invite your comments via email on podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at rwilliams1947 and Matt is at the Bish F1. And if you're enjoying the show and feeling particularly generous, why not leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? Because doing so helps others to find the pod, so we'd really appreciate it.
We would indeed. And also remember, if you want to enjoy ad-free listening or treat yourself to some Colossally merchandise, there are links to both the Race Members Club and the Race Shop in the episode description. And both, dear listener, are still running Black Friday promotions, so don't delay and head there today.
So that's it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our indefatigable, nay, indomitable producer, Jonny Reynolds, and to you for listening, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.